Thank you so much for being here today. So our next panel is competitive advantage, federal contractors, and Section 503. So now we're going to dig into that other initiative, the one that focuses on what the federal contracting space will be doing. In 1973, Congress passed the Rehabilitation Act. Section 503 was designed to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in the federal workforce. In 1998, it was amended to require that any contract that the federal government enters into require the contractor to take affirmative action to employ and advance in employment individuals with disabilities. The law applies to any prime contract or subcontract over $10,000 in value. In 2014, new regulations set a goal for contractors to increase the percentage of their workforce with a disability to reach 7%. Since that benchmark was established, very few organizations have met that goal. So this session is going to dive into some of those issues, where we are, where we're going, and how that utilization goal can go from aspirational to reality. I'm excited. Our moderator, Elizabeth Guevara, Senior Manager for Inclusion, Diversity, and Giving with GDIT, unfortunately has 2 sick kids and a COVID and flu exposure, so she is not here today, and I will be your substitute moderator. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our panel. We are very fortunate to be joined by Craig Lean with K&L Gates, former Director of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, Jana Rust with Thompson Coburn LLP, and Sarah Von Schroeder, Director of Research and Program Evaluation with the Yangtan Institute on Employment and Disability at Cornell. Thank you all so much. Sarah, let's start with you. You and Suzanne Breyer had a fascinating study entitled What Works? How Federal Contractors Are Implementing Section 503. Can you talk a little bit about the findings of your study? What are the greatest takeaways and success points?
Sure. So just as a little bit of background, this was the survey that we did was in 2017. So it was about 3 years after the initial implementation of Section 503. We wrote a proposal to do this work, and we were able, as we wrote the proposal, it was funded by the Department of Labor, their evaluation office. We were able to talk to some folks at OFCCP about what they were interested in. We were planning on looking at audit data from OFCCP. They make those data public, and we were going to do some analyses there, and they said, you know what we really want to do is to hear from employers about what's working, things that can inform our programming. So we were able to work with the National Industry Liaison Group and Direct Employers, which are 2 organizations of federal contractors, as well as different disability advocacy organizations in sort of designing and disseminating a survey. As I said, we did it in 2017, so it's a little bit old now, but I will say we've continued to have conversations with employers and job seekers and individuals, employees with disabilities. And I think a lot of the lessons that we learned through the survey are still issues that are out there. So I think it's still pretty relevant. We ended up getting through our outreach about 235 employer respondents. We had a really diverse group. We had employers who were diverse in terms of size, contractors, and industry, so we had a lot of different folks who responded and got a lot of both sort of quantitative, some, you know, how are your practices changing, but also a lot of qualitative feedback about how things were going. So we had sort of 3 or 5 more main sections, or 3 or 5, depending on how you look at. We asked about sort of their setting of goals. So obviously the 7% utilization goal was a major part of this, of the new regulations. But we also were interested in how they were setting goals, how they're planning to meet goals toward that 7% goal and other parts of their, you know, in setting up more disability inclusive practices. We had a section where we asked about sort of their practices and their success around self-identification. And then we had sort of clusters of practices around recruitment, communication and training, and accommodation and networking. And so we were interested in, with these individual practices, whether they had them in place and whether these practices that we knew were good disability inclusive practices were being put in place as a result of the Section 503. So did this actually impact what they were doing? So I'll just kind of give you a quick overview of what we learned. Like 90% had changed their affirmative action goals related to employing people with disabilities as a result of the new regulations. When asked about goals specifically around recruitment or hiring, 80% had set specific goals, or at least informal goals in those areas. Fewer had set goals related to retaining and advancing individuals with disabilities. That was closer to 60%, so similar to things that we are hearing this morning. Likewise, self-identification. The response rate to the survey was quite low. Our sort of median employer, we were finding that they had about 50 to 60% completing the self-identification survey. The typical organization that responded to us had about 2% of their workforce reporting to have a disability on the form. I think that's pretty similar to what was found by OFCCP when they did their more focused reviews. We asked about how they were working to get more self-identification. So again, this was 3 years after the initial implementation. It was a lot of work to get this up and running, I think, get it into HR systems. A good portion were making it available when people were updating their personal information. They were doing some kind of annual communication. Those weren't seen as being particularly effective. There were more who were doing, there were fewer who were doing activities like a formal self-identification campaign, about 20% of the employers we talked to. Others, about 20% were spotlighting employees with disabilities who were successful in the organization. And while those practices were much less frequently used, they were deemed to be more effective. And then sort of broadly with the individual practices that we were looking at, about 80% of the organizations we talked to were partnering with community organizations who provide employment services or posting on disability-specific job boards. So about 80% had those practices in place. So if you had the practice in place, then we sort of followed up and said, did you either initiate or expand that practice as a result of the new regulations? And 70% of those said that they had either initiated or expanded those practices as a result of the new rules. And we see that pretty consistently. Again, we see about 50 to 60% were doing training for recruiters, supervisors, a little bit fewer for employees around issues related to disability. And among those who were doing it, 60% had either initiated or expanded those practices as a result of the new regulations. When we talked about accommodation and networking, we found that most, 80%, had a formal accommodation process in place, but most of them they sort of described expanding that with the most commonly described expanded practice that we had in there. And then having a disability-focused employee resource group was the most commonly initiated practice as a result of the new rules on the survey that we looked at. So big picture across all of this, I think the takeaway was, one, that these contractors were very generous with their time. They provided a tremendous amount of feedback about things that were working and not working. I can share a copy of this report with anybody who's interested, but really interesting feedback and suggestions for this. But in general, I think the big takeaway is that only 15% reported that their policies and practices did not change at all as a result of the new regulations. And about 40% said that they had little or no real major challenges in implementing the revised regulations. So, obviously there were a lot of folks who did have challenges as they moved along, and there are many recommendations in there that I think people were, as I said, generous with their time and generous with their thoughts on how things could be improved. I think the overall goal of this is to increase employment of people with disabilities in the federal contractor workforce. And of the people we talked to, of these respondents, 30% felt that there would be an increase in disability employment within their organization as a result of the new regulations. There were about 50% more who were not sure. But I think overall, sort of the feedback that we got really showed that these new regulations made a big difference in practices in organizations. And while we may not be seeing the numbers increasing as much as we would like to, I think the self-identification is a big piece of that. And we've been able to do additional studies, more focused on talking to job seekers and individual employees with disabilities about self-identification. But I think that overall that was probably the biggest challenge that we heard in our feedback. So
I strongly encourage everyone to take a look at the study because I think it's really revealing about the practices that work, about the culture shift, because even as those numbers may still be lagging those aspirational goals, I think the cultural shift that's apparent when you read this is something that really we need to see on a more broad basis. So strongly encourage that. So Craig, you spent years at OFCCP and dove really far into 503 focus reviews. Tell us a little bit about what you saw and what you found.
Certainly, thank you. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. 503, to me, there's so much potential in Section 503, even though it's an older statute, I mean, in terms of civil rights statutes from the early 70s. The Section 503 and the regulations from 2014 and some of the best practices and guidance that's been put out by OFCCP, I can see over the course of the next decade or two really substantial progress being made for people with disabilities through 503, even more in some sense than the Americans with Disabilities Act, although that is the major landmark civil rights act in this area. Because 503 has the proactive, affirmative action, outreach component, self-identification, it really is an act, is a statute that's ahead of its time. And maybe the time has reached it now because people now, what I see in the diversity, equity, and inclusion field is, self-identification is key. Your identity, bringing your identity to work, being proud of your identity, being able to talk about your identity, whether it be your race, ethnicity, LGBTQ plus status, your disability, your veteran status, whatever it may be. But identity is key. So I think that you are going to see, as more people become comfortable disclosing their disability in the workplace and know that it may help them to disclose because of accommodations they may receive or because of inclusion, proactive inclusion policies and initiatives that could help them advance in employment, I think you'll see 503 really being maybe the most significant vehicle for increasing disability employment in the United States. So it's, when I was at OFCCP, what I saw, though, was even though we had the 2014 regulations, which I strongly support, when I looked at our numbers as director, what I saw was that about 99% of our recoveries, our enforcement recoveries, were in the areas of race and gender discrimination. Only about 1%, a little less than 1%, I think, were in the area of disability discrimination. I would say we probably devoted 80 to 90% of our resources to the Executive Order 11246, and very few of our resources to the Rehabilitation Act. And I didn't fully understand that. Like, why weren't we treating disability discrimination similarly to race and gender discrimination? And I want to be clear, I think we need to do more in the area of race and gender discrimination. But I didn't understand why disability was treated so differently. And to me, when I came in, that's part of the reasons for the Section 503 focus reviews, that was part of my thinking, was that maybe OFCCP needs to really focus on 503 in some of these reviews and see what's going on here. Like, what can we do to try to enhance enforcement of 503 and also work with the business community to be able to do best practices and all those sort of things. So, part of the, I brought with me the Section 503 annual report, which I recommend that you take a look at. And even though OFCCP is not doing the 503 focus reviews anymore, they have incorporated a lot of what came through the focus reviews into their current audits. So, but when you look at this report and when I reflect back on the focus review program and my focus on 503 as OFCCP director, I would say that when you look at the contractor community, you have about 25,000 federal contractors. They employ about a quarter of the American economy, American workforce. They are not meeting the 7% utilization goal. They're at about 2 to 3%, I'd say, on average. The report says that too. None of the, this report is about 350 to 370 of the reviews that we did of corporate headquarters. And in this report, none of them had met the 7% rate in every one of their job groups. But at least that were 100 or more employees. So the rate is below 7%, and it just seems to me that there's such possibility here. And that's why when we did 503, the focus reviews, we started with putting out a number of best practices. We worked with the Office of Disability Employment Policy, with EARN and JAN, to like what are the best practices in this area, and I could talk about those later. But we had a list of about 15 of them. So we had those. Then two, we published sort of a checklist or an audit checklist how we would audit a company, and I encourage companies to take that checklist and to apply it to their own company and to see if they meet it, whether you're a federal contractor or not. And then number 3, I asked companies to really lean into this. You know, a big focus of the 503 program when I was there was getting CEOs and leadership to really embrace disability and to talk about it in a way that wasn't so legal. You know, that's one of the concerns I had in this area, was that so much of, in large part because of the ADA, and you know, again, the ADA is a very powerful civil rights statute and very positive, but there's a lot of confidentiality around the ADA, and understandably so. But if in the long run, the goal is to have people feel comfortable talking about being disabled in the workplace, we need to move away a little bit from some of the sort of the legalistic protections and actually talk about disability in the workplace in a positive way and encourage people to get accommodations, not worry like what is the legal, like do we have to grant this accommodation, how do we handle this, is there liability here, if we take on this employee are we taking on potential liability, you know, how do we talk about disability, should we even mention disability because of the legal implications. General counsel's office typically are very conservative in this area, which I found now being in private practice. So, you know, the goal is to, you know, my thought was, well, have the Department of Labor publish that you can do these things. And then you can show the general counsel, hey, they say that we can have disability inclusion programs. We can have a disability ERG. We can ask employees to self-ID. So, you know, that was a huge part of this effort too.
I think that's a perfect lead-in for our next question. And one thing that, you know, our partner, our National Organization on Disability, some of the early conversations I had with them, we dove into this self-identification. And I think it's important just for anyone who may not know, self-identification is very different than disclosure when you need an accommodation, right? You can self-identify as having a disability and not necessarily require an accommodation from your employer. But disclosure in the ways that then you can advocate for yourself, self-identification leads to that. And especially if you have an accommodation that you maybe bring with yourself or otherwise, anyway, that's a little bit of I wanted to make sure that we had some of that context because I think as we turn to Jana, self-identification is obviously a huge component to ensuring that people with disabilities feel included in their workforce, feel like they're identified. So can you talk a little bit about self-identification, specifically harmful stigmas that might discourage it? Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, excuse me. I think even the fact that you went through that explanation here within this group is evidence of the difficulties that contractors have. Because this is a group that already is very active in the disability community, and your knowledge of the fact that they may not understand the difference is, I think, key to the fact that contractors themselves sometimes struggle with understanding the difference and their potential employees or their actual employees, because that is a key difference in that self-ID component. And so one, the contractor who's asking this question really has to understand the background of why they're asking. And that means not just the company, but the literal HR person who's passing along these documents to the employee or potential employee. And then the employee has to know why they're filling this out. Because, and I think your comment earlier, ma'am, about some people with physical disabilities, a lot of them may get them later in life. They may not know sometimes some of these things that they are doing and how they're used, because this may be something they've only experienced 5 years before, 10 years before, not something they've experienced since childhood. So they may not know why they're filling this out, what it's going to be used for, and in their mind, if they're not asking for an accommodation, they may think, I don't need to fill this out, there's no purpose for it. And I mean, I think something that you probably saw at OFCCP is that there's really not a personal, necessarily immediate benefit for the person filling it out. The benefits to the company, so they can understand whether or not they're meeting that 7% goal. And even that benefit is somewhat limited because it's a good faith effort. So there's not kind of all of those things happening. So beyond even the stigma, I think there's the knowledge piece. Then there is the stigma part of it. I think in particular for some people who have the disabilities that are not necessarily visible, they don't want to make them visible. And that's always a hurdle to overcome. But then there's the question of what is the information going to be used for? And on the self-ID form, there's very explicit information about what it's going to be used for. But I think some of the things that we're seeing now, including there's been a FOIA request for certain OFCCP information related to race and gender. If those FOIA request litigation cases keep moving forward, I think we're going to see that harming self-identification across the board, whether it's race or gender or disability, because many people already worry about that stigma. So I think it's a hurdle we will continue to see.
Yeah. So I want to build on this a little bit because, part of the reason this conference is happening is we want to be able to talk about the intersection or the opportunities between the AbilityOne space and general broader federal contracting. And so, in the AbilityOne space, there is a documented disability. You actually have to document the disability in order for someone to be eligible. Part of the regulation has that direct labor ratio where a certain number of hours, 75%, must be performed by a person with a disability, and it's incumbent upon the contractor to go through beyond self-identification, right? Like really documenting that disability to be able to support the accommodations. So when we think about the relationships that could exist between a federal contractor making those good faith efforts and an AbilityOne contractor who may have a lot of experience in helping people with disabilities feel comfortable in advocating for themselves, supporting themselves, and getting what they need. Can we talk a little bit about the contracting process and how those relationships might develop, particularly because these don't form overnight, right? You don't pick a subcontractor in 3 months as you make a bid, you pick it over years. Do you guys have some thought on that? How might this contracting process play out over some of these issues, if that makes sense? Sorry, I changed the question a little bit.
Yeah, and I can start, and I'd love to hear you all's thoughts as well, and if some of the best practices had kind of included that. But I think there's different points in the contracting process to become a subcontractor. One is before the solicitation even hits the street, and that's during the market research time for the agency. So when the agency issues an RFI or request for information or market research requests, that's often a time when folks, and by folks I mean the prime contractors or potential prime contractors, start to look for subcontractors that they may be able to use. Then there's the time period, of course, when they're actually working on their bids or proposals. That's going to be a lot harder. That time period is a lot harder to form a relationship because the prime contractors they're in this mode where their proposal writers are staying up all night. It is, for some companies, it can mean the life or death of the company. And so they are not really looking at kind of going beyond their original plan, and they are just working hard on developing their proposal. And it's a lot harder, I think, to develop those prime sub relationships. Then there's the time period of after a contract's been awarded. So then you know who the winner is, and at that time, sometimes companies are looking to add teams to their, or looking to add subcontractors to their teams, but oftentimes they're tied to the folks that they included in their proposal because that's who they promised the government they would provide to do certain services. So it's a little bit harder to get in at that point. However, then there's the performance period. So once the contractor is there and performing, there's potential opportunities to subcontract then, and that's a little bit dependent on whether or not the prime contractor has that need, and whether or not they had a team member at the beginning, or whether or not a team member fell out. And so there's a number of places to come in, but it can be a very long process to get there.
Well, what I would say is that, most federal contractors, almost all, are not meeting that 7% goal. I did meet one contractor that was at 14%, which I won't say who they are, but it was a big company, but wow, did they lean into disability. They had their CEO was part of that effort. They would have frequent campaigns. They had a number of ERGs for disability, and that was really tremendous. But most companies are not there. Whereas, as you mentioned, AbilityOne, a lot of companies are at a very high ratio. So, and of course, there's been some pressure to try to have that ratio go down for AbilityOne. So there's going to be available workers that potentially, that Ability One has that could potentially help federal contractors meet their goals. And I would highly recommend that every federal contractor try to have a relationship with vocational rehabilitation agencies, of course, in their area, but also Ability One providers. I think that Ability One providers will be able to do consultation and help companies put together their 503 programs. How are you able to get to 75%, and we can't get to 7%? So I think that that's going to be, it's a real opportunity. And I would say one other thing, about the stats I see say between about a 20 and 25% of the population has a disability. And when you look at the list of disabilities on OFCCP's self-identification list, and they're updating it to add even more in the neurodiversity area, if you look at that list and you think about at some point in my life, well, I have one of these conditions, it could, at least in a temporary or permanent way, probably almost everyone at some point in their life is either temporarily or permanently disabled. So this is something that we all should really care about. The fact that the goal is 7%, which is much lower than potential availability of 25, we should be able to meet it. Now, having said that, we're still in a world where the labor force participation rate for people with disabilities is about 1 in 5, compared to 60 to 65% for the general population. So we have a ways to go. But I would say one thing with self-ID, not to change the subject, but I wanted to get back to one thing you said, and also that you said. There is a benefit to self-IDing, and we need to try to lean into that too. Because, when I was at OFCCP, what I wanted to do, my vision, was that we would use the self-ID information. First, we'd encourage people to self-ID. We'd have a broad list of examples. We'd tell people you don't necessarily need to have an accommodation to self-ID. I self-ID'd myself because I had a condition that was on the list. And and I would encourage people to do it. I would talk about it, and I'd have people with disabilities who were comfortable talking about it at OFCCP talk about it. And that was helpful. And if you have people in organizations, that can be helpful. But in the end, the goal is to take that self-ID data in the long run, and similar to race and gender, to run audits on it, to see, well, okay, for the part of our workforce that is self-identified with a disability, what is the pay gap? What are our hiring rates? And just like OFCCP does for race and gender, that would be the long-term goal. Then there would be a benefit to people with disabilities self-IDing, because then there would be an understanding that that self-ID might help them in the long run to be treated fairly in the workplace and to not have to suffer a wage gap, not have a glass ceiling, but be able to advance. And I think in the long run, that has to be the goal. Anyway, I'm sorry but I wanted to make that point.
No, absolutely. One thing that we haven't really touched on that I know that we kind of talked about in our prep call was about different employment categories and how disability compliance is higher in certain categories or other. Do you have any thoughts you'd want to share on that? You had some employment category stuff.
What was it? Forgive me.
The different jobs and employment categories and how someone identifies or not, and where the compliance was for some of the contractors who you evaluated as the focus.
Yeah, so what I would say is that, one concern I had, and you hear this sometimes in the neurodiversity area. I have a daughter who's autistic. I've been an autism advocate for a long time. And she has intellectual disability as well. And I also work with a number of people who are autistic, the actually autistic community. That's the tagline they use. Many of them use, and who may not have an intellectual disability. In fact, may be extraordinarily gifted in a particular area. What I've seen, though, in that area is that companies are pretty good at focusing on bringing on people with disabilities when people are joining the company. But like with autistic individuals, one thing you'll often see, I just saw it again posted on LinkedIn by someone who's autistic, that autistic individuals will stay at an organization for a long time. They're very loyal. And there's some truth to that for people with disabilities generally too, because if you have to get an accommodation and go through this process and you're concerned about being discriminated against, it makes it harder for you to, you may be less likely to want to move to another company where you might be exposed to discrimination if you're happy in this place. But that exposes people with disabilities, because the market is disrupted for that individual. They can't just easily go from job to job. You tend to see salary discrimination, at least systemically. Maybe not for a particular individual, but generally you see a pay gap. And you also see promotion discrimination. It's harder to be promoted. You know, particularly if you've disclosed that disability and someone, because of stigma, thinks that, oh, well, you know, they're doing good in their current post, but we don't know how they'll do in this next post. You know, so, maybe we won't advance them. You know, and that is discrimination, but it's something that a lot of times people do, not to defend it at all, I think it's wrong. But in their own minds, they maybe think they're trying to help that person. You know, but it's not helping them. You know, it's condescending. And the goal is to try to let that person decide for themselves how much they want to advance. Anyhow, so what I found that companies did not have much in terms of the category of executives and professional sort of posts and advancing to those posts. Companies didn't have much in that area, I found. And like for law firms, for example, if you look at the NALP survey, that they're the ones who do they do the survey, and there's underrepresentation of women, women of color, people of color, and most LGBTQ+ individuals. I will tell you, there's a huge underrepresentation of people who self-identify as having disability. For partners at law firms, it rounds to 0%. It's literally 0.47% or something like that the last time I looked. 0%. Now, I'm at a law firm. I'm sure that the actual rate's higher than that, but I'm sure it's pretty low. But lawyers don't feel comfortable, apparently, disclosing that they have a disability, probably because of the stigma associated with it. But it just shows how that means law firms, whether you're a contractor or not, you need to do more to encourage people with disabilities to self-ID, have a disability ERG. We just started one at K&L Gates, and I'm a co-chair of it, and get law firms and companies to really lean into that and to consider disability at every part of the organization.
That's such an important point. We talk a lot about retention and promotions within the Ability One space and others. We talk about that upward mobility, those opportunities to learn new skills and build on to the next skills. And I think it gets a little bit to Sarah, to the cultural shift that you guys were trying to see, that companies that really leaned in to some of those best practices had better results with 503 compliance. Do you have anything more you'd want to share on some of those cultural shifts that you guys noticed in your study?
Yeah, at first I might just mention that we've actually been doing a study in the federal sector. And so in the federal sector, there's been data collected on disability for a lot longer than we've been collecting data in the private sector under Management Directive 715. And it's the same thing as holding true where we see people with disabilities overly represented in certain lower job categories, lower GS levels. And we were able to do sort of focus groups with job seekers and representatives from the federal sector. And it comes back to a comment someone made earlier today about accessibility, I think, a lot. So a lot of the opportunities to move up in organizations may require an accommodation, may require you to be present, do a specific, short-term role that might not be possible for an individual, or it may require doing training that is not being made accessible, or there may not be accessible opportunities. And then there's not also a lot of data collection specifically around how these advancement opportunities are being made. So they don't necessarily look at whether people sort of at the same level are being given the same opportunities, people with and without disabilities. And so I think we have a little more information in the federal sector over a longer period of time. And I think sort of the same things are likely playing out in the private sector, and we're just starting to get data. And I think it's so important that organizations are using that data and looking at very specific questions about advancement opportunities and promotion. I will just say that our research really makes it very clear that there are practices that are critical. Like I think Greg was just talking about the having that high level commitment to doing to disability inclusion, demonstrating that by having leaders in the organization self-identifying. That's a huge piece that we see being very strong. We did a study recently on we know that the messaging, it all comes down to trust with self-identification. And so employer messaging is really important. So that top management leadership messaging, having we did specifically looked at Fortune 500 company career pages, and so how they were messaging around disability inclusion. And we had sort of good practices, about 20 of them, and sort of did an audit of these Fortune 500 company career pages, whether they were looking at and talking about disability inclusion. And a lot of them were doing very, very little. But I think a lot of that messaging, and what we found from sort of a survey we did with job seekers, is having information, having flexibility, demonstrating that they're committed. The top things that came out were sort of having flexible work arrangements, having information about work-life balance programs, having information about disability-focused hiring programs, and then making sure that your disability inclusion statement is beyond the boilerplate and really talks about disability inclusion and has examples of people with disabilities in the organization. And those are things that can be really meaningful to people as they both are looking at whether to apply for an organization, but also whether they'd be willing to self-identify, would have the comfort and the trust in the organization. It's more than that, but that messaging is really important and really demonstrating it.
So we know the best practices. We know kind of what's working, what's successful. We know what we'd like to encourage more folks to do. We know that you can get 14% if you have an entire organizational buy-in. So I'm going to ask a potentially loaded question. Those are all the carrots, right? So how do we improve compliance and adherence to the 7% utilization goal? Is there a stick? Is there room for a mandatory requirement? What do we need to help people get there if the carrots are out there?
Well, there was discussion of a mandatory requirement in 2014, and the compromise was the 7% utilization goal, good faith. Now, I would like to see OFCCP publish some guidance that says that good faith, though, over the course of years, eventually means you got to get there and becomes closer to a requirement at some point. That needs to be said, and there needs to, that was one of the, there's not much guidance on what good faith is, to be honest, right now from OFCCP. But there needs to be more. And I think that was part of the goal of the focus review programs. Then two, whether you make it mandatory, which, some companies may like that because then it allows it, because again, a lot of the concern sometimes is, can we do a disability hiring program? Can we actually favor in employment people with disabilities? Well, yes, you are allowed to, because people without disabilities are not considered a protected class, so you are allowed to favor in employment people with disabilities. And in fact, there's a need to because of the very low labor force participation rate. So we know that we're missing a lot of people with skills. So there's a true benefit to affirmative action in this area and reaching out. So if you made a requirement, I'm sure companies would meet the requirement. They would go out there and they would have a compliance division focused on identifying people with disabilities. That also would lead more people to self-ID, I'm sure, because they would want to be able to benefit from the ability to reach that 4%. And it hasn't really worked with the 7% because it's not I guess it hasn't been viewed as a strong enough goal.
Aspirational.
But that was the thinking, that, well, yeah, if you're applying, then it could help you to self-ID. And then the last point I would make, when I was at OFCCP, I proposed as part of the focus reviews, and my vision was eventually this would be part of all reviews, was what I mentioned before, that we would start looking at the disability self-ID data, the percentage, and we would, for those employees, we would look at their hiring, compensation, promotions, just like we did based on race and gender. And the Secretary of Labor supported that, and this was in the former administration, so a Republican administration, but it was, the Department of Labor supported that. It ultimately got blocked at the OMB level. And I think the concern was that it was not deregulatory in nature, and the former administration was very focused on deregulation. I had hoped that they would make an exception in this area because there's such a need. But so be it. I was hopeful that the Biden administration would take that up, and pursue something like that. So far, it hasn't happened. But I do think that in the long run, I don't understand why, whatever you think of OFCCP, I strongly believe in OFCCP. And I advise management and clients. But let me tell you, the companies are ahead of the government in this area. They care deeply about diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. And there's a lot of support for OFCCP among the clients I talk to. But having said that, whatever your thoughts on OFCCP and compliance and all of these things, why is OFCCP treating race and gender differently than disability? That I don't understand. because there's similar wage gaps for disability compared to the gender and race wage gaps. There are intersectional issues that tie to race and gender and disability. There are, the labor force participation rate is much lower than for other groups. There's overt discrimination against people with disabilities still. So why wouldn't you audit on disability? And I think that a lot of companies would embrace that because it would allow them to then do all these things, because they could tell the general counsel's office, instead of saying, well, you know, there's not much benefit to doing this legally. Now, of course, there's always a benefit DEI, but there's not much benefit legally, and there's risk, which is what some of them say. Now they'll say, you know what, we have to do this. We're being told to do this. There's a regulation to do this. We're already doing it in these other areas, so it's not a huge additional burden. They're already doing it, but now we'll just do it in this one area as well. Why treat ableism as not as important as racism or sexism? That was what I would always say at disability. We need to address all of them, and we need to eliminate all of them.
Such a great point. Anyone else have, Gina, you have something?
I was going to add to that. I think the difficulty of having any mandatory requirement is going to be the fact that self-ID has been so low for some contractors. So those contractors are going to push back against any mandatory requirement, because they're going to say, we can't force people to provide us this information if they don't want to. So you have to give us some kind of an out to not comply if we have low self-identification rates. And I think that's the kind of thing that would probably end up being litigated if certain, depending on how the regulation or the law was written around that. So I think that's a little bit of a hurdle on that side. And then on the carrot side, though, I do think that there are other carrots that just haven't been given yet. I do think the vast majority of contractors are for-profit. Their goal is to make more money. And the way that they then look at business partners or certain activities is surrounded by how they can make more money, which is oftentimes also implicated with how they get more contracts. So we have seen in the government contracting sphere, for instance, once agencies start to look at certain aspects in past performance, that's a carrot that can move things along. So as the federal government has now focused a little bit more on prime contractors, compliance with their small business plans, we've seen prime contractors start to focus a lot more on doing better with their small business plans, because they know if they don't, they're not going to get the next contract. So that's one of the carrots that I think is out there. I think we also see preferences that start to move the carrot on things. So I know, there's domestic preference policies. If a contractor can offer a higher rate, but they know they're getting an X% benefit for whatever type of entity or product they're offering, that's still something we see. So that's why we'll see it in the domestic preference policy world, or for hub zones, the historically underutilized business zones. Those entities know they can offer a higher price and are still going to be competitive because of a set preference that's out there. So I do think there's still some carrots that exist that can be offered from the federal government that we haven't seen quite yet.
Love to see some points on bid or something like that, if you, just saying. So, earlier, Craig, you mentioned that there were some best practices that came out that asked companies as a best practice to look at local vocational rehabilitation offices as a place where they could get support. Folks with, intellectual developmental disability organizations that they may have. How can maybe those of us in this room support efforts to get Ability One to be one of those best practices? Sure.
Yes, so in the report, there's 9 best practices. Actually, it doesn't have Ability One, which it should. That's something, one, let's talk to OCCP and have them put that as a best practice, because that is a best practice. That would be something that could be extremely helpful. 2, I would say companies, one other thing I've seen, and this could tie to this too, is that, like for diversity, equity, inclusion programs, many companies have them now. Almost every federal contractor and most companies I've seen. I advise on that and on pay equity. And what I see, though, is that most DEI programs don't include disability at all. So it typically, and they should, and they need to, include race and gender. and they typically don't include disability. I think only 5% of DEI programs in the surveys I've seen include disability as a protected class. So, that would be something that could be extremely helpful to include disability and also talk about the intersectionality between race, gender, and disability. That even within the disability community, certain underrepresented groups can be harmed because of a lack of access to social services or special education or whatever it may be, that it's not fair, even the access within the disability community. But generally, so including disability in a DEI program is a big deal. Now, if you did that, you probably also would then have a lot of, in my experience with the DEI programs, they have a lot of proactive things that they'll do, including outreach and recruitment to minority organizations, to, for example, in law firms, the Black Law Students Association, the Hispanic National Bar Association. But then you would also do outreach and recruitment to disability organizations, including to Ability One, because that would be part of your DEI program. And then the other thing I would do, and I won't go through all the best practices, but one best practice, having a chief accessibility officer, and you might call that a chief DEIA officer, and by the way, add the A to DEI. Include accessibility, that's incredibly important, but have a chief accessibility officer or chief DEIA officer that looks at accessibility, and then that person will have a list of outreach and recruitment and things like that they do to enhance disability inclusion, and they may consult with Ability One providers, for example. And I just did a webinar with the Chief Accessibility Officer of Canada, Stephanie Cadieux. Look her up. It's amazing what she's doing in Canada. Why don't we have a Chief Accessibility Officer in the United States? I don't understand that. We're the country that did the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act that most countries look to in terms of disability inclusion, and we don't have a Chief Accessibility Officer in the United States reporting to the President? I mean, come on, we should have had that 10 years ago.
Such a good point. I watched that webinar, by the way. It was quite a delight. So at this point, let's turn to questions from the audience. Oh, Larissa.
One of the thoughts I had with respect to self-identification is, has there been a thought to having kind of a third party take that information to be able to give employees confidence that and assurances that that specific information is not going to be shared with the HR office of the employer, but that entity, perhaps an Ability One entity, could certify to the employer that this percentage of people have self-identified. And it could just stop there at self-identification, not necessarily having to go through the processes that we go through to confirm disability, look at doctor's notes, all of that.
I have not heard of anything like that. I'm wondering, as I said, I think a lot of the self-identification is based on trust in the organization, and so taking it outside of the organization, I'm not sure that until people really see the benefit of self-identifying, I'm not sure that would help, but if it was very clear that the data was being used in a way, toward, looking at compensation gaps or you being used to look at advancement rates, when that's really being demonstrated, I think that would be a big step forward. But it's interesting. Maybe that would make a difference. I know that people are much more likely when we ask, they're less likely to fill out a form like a self-identification form than they are to tell their manager that they have a disability or tell people within their organization in a less formal way. Potentially for the need for an accommodation would be a big reason you might do that, but you might also sort of more informally talk about your disability at work, but still not being willing to fill out that form. So,
is the self-ID question asked primarily at the time of hire, or is it ever asked again when I think you might get a better chance, frankly?
Yeah, I believe, and Craig would know for sure, but it's pre-offer, post-offer, and every 5 years. And I think companies are trying to do it more annually, give the opportunity, or when you update your personal information in the workforce.
But I would say even in this area, it's a little complex because I know a lot of companies want to be able to ask for that information so they can form a disability ERG or use it for some of their affirmative action activities. But, there is and I have to say the guidance isn't very clear on this, but, it's very clear you don't use it for employment decision purposes, and it has to be kept separate from your personnel file, and it's not going to be told to your supervisor because you self-ID, but yet companies should be able to use that as part of their affirmative action efforts, I think, or at least be able to self-ID. One, this is for government purposes. Two, this is for the company as part of our DEIA program. Right now, there's, particularly for non-federal contractors who want to do a disability self-ID, there's a concern because the EOC has been really, respectfully, way behind on this. They have not published guidance that specifically says that you can ask for self-ID for disability. In fact, it typically says that you're not supposed to ask about disability when people apply. Now, there is some caveats, and it's on EARN and AskJan as well, that say that, well, if you're doing it for the benefit of people with disabilities, you can do it as part of a voluntary affirmative action plan, or maybe a DEI program, you could argue. But I think you can, because of that guidance that's there, but it would be great if EOC would come out and OFCCP, maybe as part of their hire initiative, and talk about DEIA programs and self-ID and how to use this information and how to get ahead of this. Because right now the companies are way ahead of the federal agencies on this topic.
And I would say also to that point, and one of the comments you made about how, what happened in your research about kind of standalone programs doing well, I do think that probably could make a difference if literally the only question, there was kind of this programming to say we're encouraging you to self-ID for this reason, ask that question only and be done. And I say that not from my experience working with contractors, I see that from my experience as being an Asian American woman, and how many times I've started some kind of a survey, then it ends with demographic questions, and it says, are you a female, yes or no, what race are you, and I'm looking, like in this room. If I answered yes or no to those questions, I know every single answer that I gave is gonna be tied to me. I'm the only Asian American female in this room. And so there's so many times when I've been answering surveys like that where I've just literally stopped. And I could see that is gonna be an issue on some of the employment questions. So if I'm updating that employment information and other things at the same time, I just don't want that tied back to me for whatever reason. Maybe it's because I'm giving somebody great praise, or maybe it's because I'm criticizing something. And so I think if you can separate it sometimes, from my own view, I think people are sometimes going to be more likely to answer.
Although I would say it'd be great to have your disability ERG help lead your self-ID effort, and be part of it, and encourage people, and send emails to the whole company saying, don't target people. Send it to the whole company saying, we care about disability, we want to be at the forefront here, we want to be fully inclusive, if you need an accommodation, we want to grant it, and we'd like you to be part of this ERG if you'd like. Contact the head of our ERG, who's this person, if you'd like to be part of that.
We also include allies here.
And of course, yes, 100%, include allies. Make it open to allies and encourage allies to be part of the ERG.
This brings us back to the age-old visible and invisible disabilities, because I roll up to, I can't get in the door most of the time. I don't have a choice but disclosing that I'm disabled. We actually did a trial during 2020 where I interviewed for 7 jobs, got them all, got into the in-person, and then couldn't get in the buildings. Knowing full well ahead of time, I knew I couldn't get into the buildings, nor did I want the jobs that they were offering. But we did it as a study to show that we're capable, we're comparable, we can do the job, but we can't get in the building. So I wonder how much of those 7% are checking the boxes than they are, because all the DEI that we have in our state, they'll hire a person of color or somebody that's in a marginalized community to check that box, but they won't include us of the physical disability and part of that. So having the DEIA as a permanent set to it, adding the accessibility makes a huge difference, but how can we hold them accountable to actually doing physical disabled people when they don't have a choice?
That's an excellent question.
I mean, you would hope that they had a door that was compliant with the DOJ standards and things like, so that's very troubling, and that they have accessible parking. You had that experience though with 7. That's very troubling.
Yeah, but I mean, they even do accessible parking, but they're not actually accessible because they don't actually get what accessible parking is. Like every time you go to an event, they put food trucks in the accessible parking and make a regular spot an accessible spot. Well, that's not accessible.
That's not acceptable.
You know what I mean? And that's the whole problem is I have to disclose, obviously, because I can't hide it. Especially my rhinestones, I can't hide. But we need to be able
And I do think if there were to ever become a mandatory requirement, I think what you're highlighting is exactly what we'd see. We'd see a push, and I don't want to be a negative Nancy on that, but I do think we'd see a push for companies to say, we need people with mental health issues who haven't self-disclosed yet to help us get to our 7% number, and not necessarily work on the outreach of it. And unfortunately, I think also just talking to employers, one of the comments that they'll make sometimes are, we comply with the ADA, point blank, that's all we're doing. And, you know, I think some of your comments are pointing to the fact that even doing the bare minimum isn't going to help with the recruitment side of things, because just because you have an ADA compliant bathroom somewhere doesn't mean it's gonna be, you know, as good for recruiting and help on that side of things.
I mean, and look, we're having a discussion on disability, and I'm the only one in this room sitting here in a wheelchair because the city of Washington is not accessible. I rode around last night for an hour trying to find a place just to eat that I could roll into. This is why more of us are not here to have this important conversation. We can't even get them to the table for the conversation. How do we get them out and about to be seen and heard out and about? I don't care, I roll in and I'll figure it out.
My daughter uses a very large wheelchair, and I always have to plan. And I always go on like websites to see, do they have like an autism at sea program, like we went on a cruise, or you know, do they care about disability? Do they have an accessibility page? You're absolutely right. There's so much more that needs to be done in that area. I would say though that if you do have a mandatory rate, and it was, let's say it was 7% is the goal, and the mandatory is 3 to 4, something like that. There would be some degree of checking the box, but I also believe that there would be good faith, you know, in terms of compliance and companies saying, well, we need to expand our disability hiring. There would be a benefit to people with disabilities, I believe. And even if it's having people with mental health disabilities be told, we welcome you with your disability and we want you to disclose, and we're not going to stigmatize you for having anxiety disorder or depression or PTSD or ADHD. I still think that would be positive.
And actually, your comment about accessibility in websites, it raises something that I know someone over here asked earlier today. I do think if at some point we could see a contract requirement that internal contractor websites had to have similar requirements like Section 508, I think we'd probably start to see some movement in certain types of hiring within contractors there. And I say that because I do think within the last decade, I've seen the federal government making much more of an effort for its Section 508 compliance and making sure its websites are accessible. And so I do think we're seeing, more opportunity for people to help with that effort, but also I do think as contractors, if we could start to see that as a mandate, I think that's probably something that would change accessibility opportunities.
And with that, go ahead,
I just
Brett.
have a small observation. I got into the disability field probably about 8 years ago. I'm a labor lawyer and I was involved in it largely before that. But, well, no, it's all right. I mean, I can speak. I said I just have a small observation. I've been in the disability field for about 8 years, and when I came to it, it was for an organization that was acquired by Melwood, and we were very proud of you. One of the things that strikes me about this conversation is the self-identification aspect. And when I came into that predecessor organization, we were very proud of ourselves as a board that we had adopted the phrase differently abled. And we were thrilled with that and made us all feel very good. But I myself suffered a brain injury and I had short-term memory disorder, short-term memory deficit. And in dealing with that, you know, I would go around and say, I didn't want to contradict what we were doing in the disability community. So I'd say I have a brain injury, because if I used the word differently abled, people didn't know what the heck I was talking about. And when I spoke to many of the others at Melwood, the people that we serve, my fellow disabled individuals at Melwood, what we also realized there was that we require clarity in dealing with employers. We require clarity in dealing with the world around us. And differently able didn't really serve us. And I think getting our message consistent across all of us here and all of our kinds of organizations is going to be very helpful in encouraging people to self-identify. When I deal with elderly people, I'm getting there myself, in any event, when I deal with them that are dealing with dementia, what have you, or Alzheimer's or what have you, I say it's imperative that you tell somebody up front that you have a memory disability. You need to let the person know that maybe you don't understand something not because you're not paying attention, not because you're not interested, not because you're not dedicated to the task at hand. And so clarity is just vitally important, and I'm so glad to see that we're concentrating as a community here on the self-identification factor. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Brad. With that, we are out of time because we would like to do lunch. Please feel free to ask your questions. Thank you so much to our wonderful panel. We hope you have great lunch discussions. What? Lunch is here. You don't leave. Yes, by the way, we're providing lunch. Sorry. Thank you.